I'm going to give you an overview of the South Yorkshire Natural Capital and Biodiversity Mapping project that we completed about a year ago, at least now. But there's a lot of detail in here, and it was a lot of work, and the report on the MCA website will go through all of that. So I do think it would be a good idea if you look at that, because you're not going to get the finer details here today, but feel free to ask questions at the end to dig out some more detail. So I'm going to give you the main headlines of what we did and what we found. So I know that hopefully most of you haven't seen this talk before, or me talking about this, but I know some of you have. So those of you who are involved in the project, or some discussions after the project, this is probably not going to be new to you. Just a warning. So first of all, let's set the scene. I'm going to talk about what's called natural capital a lot, and use the phrase ecosystem services. So just so everyone's on the same page, natural capital is the stock of natural assets. So by that I mean habitats, water, soil, and certainly biodiversity being the foundation of that. And natural capital produces a wide range of benefits that we as people benefit from. For instance, provisioning services are things like food, timber, and water. Regulating services are things like climate regulation, noise regulation, water quality, water flow regulation, and air quality regulation. And we also have what are called cultural ecosystem services, which are recreation, aesthetic experiences, increases in health and well-being as a result of being out in green or blue spaces. And all of these are supported by what we call supporting functions or intermediate services, which are processes such as soil formation, photosynthesis, and nutrient recycling, essential functions for supporting natural capital assets, the ecosystem services that flow from there, and therefore the benefits that people gain from them. So why are we interested in looking at the world from this perspective, if you like? Well, an important report in 2021 called the Dasgupta Review showed that, and we've been talking about this for years, but these diagrams from that report really sum it up, I think. So what we have to accept is that our economies and societies are not separate from the natural world. They're absolutely integrated into it. So that's what the diagram on the left is showing. On the right, what this diagram is showing really is how dependent we are on that natural capital for the way that we live, for the use of natural resources in our industries, and providing food and fuel and shelter to people. So natural capital is absolutely key for other types of capitals, for instance, produce capital and human capital. And with our economies and societies, there are externalities. So we do cause things like pollution and waste, and manage our land and water in a way that can degrade natural capital. And the problem with that is that if we're taking a natural capital approach, we'll see that a degradation of natural capital then means that there is a degradation of the benefits that it's providing to people. So we have to recognise this integration and understand that if we can enhance natural capital, then we will enhance the benefits to us, which will in turn enhance our economies and our societies. And there are other reasons why we need to pay attention to natural capital now, because it's very much integrated into policy and legislation at the national level, and it's filtering down to the local level as well, or the regional level. So the 25-year plan was published in 2018, and we now have a follow-up to that, which is the Environmental Improvement Plan, both of which are outlining ways of enhancing the environment, ensuring there's cleaner air, clean and plentiful water, mitigating against climate change, and enhancing biodiversity. And those were setting goals in order to do that. We also have what's called the Green Finance Strategy, which should be coming soon, which is a way a government's going to harness private finance to achieve some of the goals that have been outlined in the Environmental Improvement Plan. 25-year plan, and has certainly led to changes in legislation. So we now have the Environment Act, we have the Agriculture Act, which was focused on what we're going to do in terms of agriculture once we left the EU. We have the Climate Change Act, which also sets net zero target for 2050. And we have National Planning and Policy Framework, which also talks about the importance of recognising and identifying the importance of natural capital in planning, as well as biodiversity. And so all these aspirations and goals and legislations are leading to leading to legislation, for instance, 10% biodiversity net gain for development, possibility of up and coming environmental net gain. And like Laurie mentioned, nature recovery strategies and nature recovery networks. We also have a variety of ELM schemes, environmental land management schemes for agriculture, to make that more sustainable and to pay for farmers to provide public goods. We have net zero carbon emission by net zero carbon by 2050, and we have slightly different targets for that at the South Yorkshire level. I think it's 2040. Woodland creation targets have the idea also recently that everyone should be living within 15 minutes walk from green or blue space, and we have also the aspiration of 30% land and sea for nature. So there's a lot going on in terms of legislation and policy and goals at the national level that incorporate natural capital, which means we really need to pay attention to it. So the South Yorkshire mapping project, as Laurie said, was commissioned with the idea of understanding or setting a baseline for natural capital at South Yorkshire level. So there are various aspects to this. We wanted to understand, first of all, what the natural capital assets of South Yorkshire were. We also looked at the biodiversity side, trying to understand what the condition of some of those habitats were, and also assigning biodiversity units to each of those habitats in South Yorkshire. We also mapped ecosystem service provision and demand, so 11 different services. We also attempted to put a monetary valuation on some of those services as well, which I'll show you later. We also looked at opportunities. So we mapped opportunities for creating new habitat, for enhancing biodiversity and ecosystem service provision. And we also mapped areas where habitat was in poor condition that could be good candidates for better management and restoration. And then we created a series of combined maps which showed biodiversity opportunities or habitat creation opportunities and also ecosystem service benefit opportunities at the same time. And I'll show you some of those maps as we go through the talk. So first of all, the baseline. So this is the natural capital asset map, or the habitat map for South Yorkshire. So this was the first stage of the mapping. So what you can see here, you'll see the urban areas. So urban areas in grey and urban infrastructure with the sort of reddy brown colours are gardens. So you can see Sheffield, Doncaster, Rotherham and Barnsley there. So that's quite obvious. And then there's quite a lot of yellow and light green across the area as well. So whilst the urban and gardens takes up about 20% of the land cover of South Yorkshire, the agricultural habitats in the yellow and the green take up about 44% of South Yorkshire. So it's really an area that is dominated by agriculture. But in between the urban and the agriculture, we do have some significant areas of semi-natural habitats, for instance, around 11% woodland and trees, 5% heath and 4% bog, 8% semi-natural grasslands, and also 1.5% rivers and streams. So you get a feeling here of the kind of dominant land uses, but it's good to stress that there's like a network of semi-natural habitat running through South Yorkshire as well, although it is quite fragmented. And we've got the important uplands in the west and the important lowland bog areas in the east. So the map just really gives us an idea of what's going on in terms of the natural capital assets. And from that, we could have a look and see what the provision of ecosystem services was like across South Yorkshire, and also the demand. And as I said earlier, we mapped a number of different ecosystem services, which you can see listed here. Carbon storage is actually a stock, so the others are services, so carbon sequestration, looking at air quality, noise, local climate regulation, water flow regulation, through agricultural production and timber, and access to nature and recreation. I'm going to show you some of those maps now. I'm not going to show you all of them because we would be here for a few hours if I did that. But it's good to have a talk through some of them. So we'll start with air quality regulation. So what this is doing, it's mapping the capacity of the habitats to take up air pollutants. And the key of the map is, well, a scale is 0 to 100. And the blue areas are very low in the provision of that service, going up to sort of yellowy brown areas, which are sort of a mid score, and up to the red areas, which are 100, which is doing very well. So that's a high provision of the air quality regulation service. So the areas in red tend to be the woodland areas around South Yorkshire, in and around South Yorkshire, and the moderate areas, that brown colour, they tend to be hedgerows. So you can see we had good hedgerow data in Doncaster, and you can see the crisscross network of hedgerows. But also some areas of semi-natural grassland will also be providing a low level of this service. It's just showing that woodland is particularly good and the most efficient at taking up different pollutants like particulate matter and sulphur dioxide. So that's the pattern of air quality regulation across South Yorkshire. And if we look at the demand for that service, so when I say demand, what we're doing here is modelling areas with high population density. Obviously, you'll see the urban centres very clearly here. Areas where people live around roads, which have likely to have, or main roads, the highest pollution, and also areas where there are high people that are vulnerable, so either the very old or the very young. And the areas in red, again, are the highest demand for the service, and the areas through to blue are low or no demand. And so you can see here that the main roads in and around the urban centres in South Yorkshire have the highest demand for the air quality regulation service. What's interesting, I think, is if you flick back, is that whilst admittedly we didn't have data on street trees within the urban centres, and that might change things a little bit, but there is a bit of a mismatch between the supply of that service and the demand for that service. So obviously we have many more blocks of woodland outside of the urban centres that are doing the job of or potentially doing the job of taking up pollution, but actually they're not situated in the areas where there is the highest pollution and the highest need. So we also mapped carbon sequestration. So this map's slightly different in the sense that it's not a 0 to 100 score, it's actually tonnes of carbon equivalents per hectare per year that we're mapping. The very red colours are sequestering carbon, but the lighter orange colours through to brown and blue are actually emitting carbon. So the very red areas here again, you see, are woodlands. Any woody habitat is quite efficient at sequestering carbon. Trees obviously the best. And actually, as we go through, some of the grasslands will also be sequestering carbon along with some of the upland habitats like bogs and heathland. However, it very much depends on the condition of those habitats. So we can see that there's carbon emissions on the east side of South Yorkshire, potentially around some of the more degraded bog areas. And there's also high emissions around the agricultural areas, particularly where agriculture tends to fall on peat soils. So that's the pattern for carbon sequestration. We've also mapped local climate regulation. And the model here, again, we're back to the 0 to 100, low provision blue, high provision red. The model here is really trying to, what it's showing is the ability of the green infrastructure and the blue infrastructure in this case for cooling the temperatures. So when you have very high temperatures, particularly in urban areas or in hot summers, this is the ability of the green infrastructure and blue infrastructure to actually cool that down. And you can see, again, woodland does perform very well with this, but also areas of water are also good for cooling. And we had a bit of a similar trend with the demand for this. So obviously urban centres very much the demand for urban cooling, and there were less, well, there was less green infrastructure, but also less woodland and water in those urban centres. Another service we looked at was water quality regulation. Back to 0 to 100, low provision blue areas, high provision red areas. This model was particularly based on trying, it's an erosion risk model, and erosion risk mainly from agriculture. So what it's saying is that there's a high provision of the water quality service if there's a low risk of erosion, and a low provision of the water quality service if there's a high provision of erosion. And erosion risk is high in areas with agriculture on slopes, but also near to watercourses because they're prone to get silted up, and the runoff, because the runoff takes the silt into the rivers and lowers the quality of the water. And what it's showing here is the low provision of the service is very much in arable agricultural areas. And we get a higher provision of a service where there's that network of semi-natural habitats across South Yorkshire, and particularly in the west, in the uplands, where water quality may not necessarily, there may be issues with water quality, but in terms of erosion risk compared to agriculture, it's a bit lower. So you see that contrast. So those were the maps. In terms of understanding the value of those ecosystem services, or the benefits that are provided, we also valued those ecosystem services, well, a subset of those ecosystem services, so not entirely the same set that we mapped. So we took a carbon balance, which is the balance between sequestration and emissions across the whole of South Yorkshire, and we're very much looking at emissions associated with land management and the natural capital assets, rather than emissions from anywhere else. We also valued air quality regulation. We were able to value flood reduction from woodland, amenity value, which is the value of having green space around houses and urban areas for green views and also getting out in nature. We also valued agricultural production, timber production, recreation, physical health, and mineral extraction. In terms of the carbon balance, what we found was that South Yorkshire, across its natural assets, was a net emitter. So that was because there were significant emissions from agriculture across the region. But although there were significant areas of woodland that provided sequestration and other habitats that provided sequestration, it wasn't enough to offset the emissions from agriculture. And we also found there were some habitats that were emitting, like some of the bog habitats in less good condition. However, those emissions were small, really, in comparison to the agricultural ones. That pattern differs slightly if you break it down by local authority, but if you look in the report, you can see that. So carbon balance, we can see, because of the net emissions, it's actually a cost. So in terms of how much it costs annually, it was 7.98 million annually cost due to the emissions, which over 50 years, present value, so that's the annual value over 50 years discounted, is 450 million. So I think rather than go into the detail of every service, which you can read in the report now, just to give you the sort of main trends here. So the most valuable services were air quality regulation, recreation, physical health, recreational angling, and amenity value. And you can see that there are very high numbers associated with these. And what that is it's costs avoided. So, for instance, with air quality regulation, it's the damage costs avoided of having green infrastructure that takes up pollution that therefore won't be harming human health. In terms of recreation and physical health, that's money associated with people travelling to green spaces or blue spaces, and the money they spend. Physical health is money saved. That's not going to be spent by the NHS because people going out meeting physical health guidelines in the green spaces and blue spaces will actually not necessarily be getting the same health conditions as those who don't. In terms of amenity value, that's a very valuable service because it's the increase in house prices associated with those that have a green view. So it's the uplift that a green view gives a house, uplift to the house value. So those, I think it's interesting that those are particularly high. It's not surprising that those services associated in reducing harm to human health are actually very valuable. So, for instance, air quality regulation and physical health. But I think what's interesting is that in terms of agricultural production, mineral extraction, the services, other services are actually much more valuable than those. And overall, the natural capital asset value, or the value of the benefits that flow to people from the natural assets of South Yorkshire in total come to around 18.19 billion. So what are the headlines from the ecosystem service mapping and valuation? So what we saw across all ecosystem services really is woodland is a really important asset for ecosystem service delivery. So carbon sequestration, noise regulation, climate regulation, water regulation in terms of flow and quality, and access to nature. Woodland was a very important asset. We also, bogs were important for carbon storage. We had a carbon storage map that shows that obviously those areas do store a lot in comparison to other habitats. And actually they're important, but we need to make sure that we manage them and restore them so that they're keeping hold of that carbon storage. And the upland areas and the bog areas are also important for access to nature. In terms of agriculture, we know it's dominant in the region and it is contributing to carbon emissions, and it will also contribute to low water quality and lack of accessible green spaces. So we need to think about that aspect. As I just said, value of air pollution regulation, recreation services and physical health services and amenity were high, and the overall natural capital value is over 18 billion. And what we did find also was that there was a bit of a mismatch in terms of supply and demand of some of the ecosystem services, particularly accessible nature, noise, air quality and local climate regulation. So that's the headlines for the ecosystem service mapping. But as I said at the beginning, we also looked at identifying opportunities where habitat could be restored or created for enhancing biodiversity, but also enhancing the delivery of different ecosystem service benefits. So we looked at, we took an approach where we mapped the nature networks that exist and looked at what the opportunities were for creating more woodland, more semi-natural grassland, heathland, bog and wetland. But we also looked as well at where there were areas that habitat could be created to reduce surface runoff or flood risk management, increase soil health, improve water quality, increase access to natural green space and regulate local climate, air pollution and noise. And then we created maps that combined these, so you could see where you could create habitat or restore habitat that would deliver for biodiversity enhancement, but also deliver multi-benefits for society. So I'm just going to show you a few maps from here. In terms of enhancing an ecosystem service, like I said, we looked at water flow opportunity areas. So this map shows the areas where new habitat can be created that will provide water flow regulation benefits. So it's, I think it was the top 10% of opportunities that you could create new habitats that could be grasslands or woodland, and deliver better water flow regulation in those areas and for South Yorkshire. We were also, I said, we did the network mapping for habitats, and this map shows across all of the board habitats, so grassland, heathland, wetland and woodland, the opportunities for where habitat could be created, so either woodland, grassland or wetland and heathland, that would connect up with existing habitats, creating corridors for nature and enhancing biodiversity generally. And this is one of the maps that has been used in when we've been looking at the local nature recovery strategies and creating a nature recovery network map. Also, we looked at, this map just shows the woodland creation opportunities. So it's all the opportunities you saw in the last map, but it's just looking at the woodland ones alone. We were able to show where woodland potentially can be created for connecting up existing woodlands, and obviously with woodland it provides enhanced biodiversity, but also it can provide a number of different ecosystem service benefits as well. And these locations need to be ground truthed, and decisions need to be made about whether it's appropriate to create woodland in these particular areas on a case-by-case basis. But it is definitely something that I think is it South Yorkshire Woodland Partnership have been using to come up with a woodland creation strategy and better ways of managing woodlands as well. So this is an example of one of the maps where we've been able to, where we've combined the biodiversity side and the ecosystem service side. So this is the woodland creation map that you saw before, but with ecosystem service opportunities marked on it as well. So clearly every single opportunity will be available for enhancing biodiversity, but in the key there are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 opportunities, which shows where there are more than one opportunity associated with planting or creating new woodland in that particular location. So red areas, there will be 7 different benefits. So there'll be biodiversity plus 6 different ecosystem service benefits associated with creating woodland there. So these maps really just help at sort of large scale to start to drill down into areas where we think there are opportunities, and to ground truth and to understand what is possible and where multifunctionality can be delivered. So just as an example of how these maps can be used, for instance, in sort of policy and planning context, this is the map of Doncaster, and the map on the left is called accessible nature capacity. So the areas in red are areas of green space that are high provision of the accessible nature capacity service. That means they are both accessible, but they also provide a high, what we call naturalness score. So they're more natural habitats. So for instance, you get a lower score if you're in improved grassland or arable field. You get a higher score if you're in a woodland or in a heathland or bog habitat. And you can see for Doncaster, there are particularly high provision of the service over in the east, but also some in the centre and the north. And if you compare this to the accessible nature demand map, so areas of demand here, high demand in red, where there are urban areas, high density of people, high density of vulnerable people who are in need of being able to access green space. So you can see here that there's a mismatch between, a bit of a mismatch between the supply and the demand. So the demand's very much in the urban centre, whereas the accessible nature tends to be more on the outside of that urban area. So it's possible to use the opportunity map for accessible nature, which is on the left, and it shows areas that are, could be created or made accessible, or existing areas that could be made accessible for recreation. And they are both accessible, but also score highly on the naturalness score as well. And you can see, if you compare it back to the accessible nature demand, that there are opportunities adjacent and within the urban areas and around other areas of demand. So the opportunity maps for any of the services really can be used like this to understand the differences between supply and demand, and where opportunities lie in relation to demand, and then obviously it'd be case by case basis. Each one could be looked into to see if that is actually possible to do on the ground, but also it could be a tool that is used alongside thinking about new developments in South Yorkshire area. So in terms of recommendations from this project, there were 4 main ones that you'll see outlined in the report. We've suggested that really you need to think about a move to a more sustainable agriculture because of that, because of the emissions associated with the agriculture. If that can be reduced, that would be a really good step in getting South Yorkshire into out of net emissions to net sequestration. And the next is to think about appropriately expanding woodland to enhance multiple ecosystem service benefits, and also to think about enhancing biodiversity, particularly restoring grassland and bog habitats, but also to think about creating new biodiverse and accessible green spaces for people to go out and recreate. And we know that the recreation and physical health ecosystem services are particularly valuable, so it would be a really good focus. And in terms of meeting those, like we talked about at the beginning, there's all this legislation and there are these goals, and in terms of trying to enhance both biodiversity through, for instance, nature recovery networks and nature recovery strategy, but also around agriculture through ELMS, net zero. So meeting the recommendations really can use some of these tools to try and meet them. So, for instance, thinking about sustainable agriculture and thinking about how the environmental land management scheme is rolled out in South Yorkshire across farmers, but also obviously in terms of biodiversity, and these maps are already being used to create the local nature recovery strategy, and particularly the nature recovery network. Also use these maps to think about the best places for achieving biodiversity net gain through offsetting, and that also ties into the nature recovery strategy and the nature recovery networks. Also, in terms of thinking about woodland, well, as I've mentioned already, the South Yorkshire Woodland Partnership are already thinking about their woodland creation and management strategy and using those maps to inform it. Laurie mentioned already about the green prescribing as well. And these maps can be used to understand about access to green space and potential, what the opportunities for further accessible green spaces becoming available in terms of enhancing people's health and well-being in South Yorkshire. They can also be quite useful for understanding natural flood risk management and thinking about catchment sensitive farming schemes. It can be used in local plans and when thinking about green infrastructure strategies in the local authorities of South Yorkshire. And obviously they also all interlink to a certain extent around net zero, woodland creation, and opportunities for adaptation and mitigation of climate change. So hopefully that's given you a good overview and made you think, right, I now want to go and read the report. The report link is here. It was also in your Teams invite to this meeting. So I do urge you to go and have a look. There's lots of detail in there. And I'm happy to answer any questions.